As we attack a unit such as this one, Germany, between the years 1919 and 1945, with this sub-theme of Into the Darkness and Return to Life, we need to sort of think about some of the major issues and approaches we should be taking. So I want you straight off to think about what era we're talking about. This is probably the first time you're getting into 20th century European history. You may have done some earlier periods. You've done early modern, perhaps with the French Revolution or medieval, but this is a modern European history unit looking at 20th century history. Chronologically, in terms of time period, and think about those times when teachers have gotten you to draw timelines. Chronologically, this period we're looking at is bookended between the First World War, 1914 to 1918, generally accepted, and the Second World War, 1939 to 45. Politically, the period is dominated around the world by a rise of dictatorships. And I've got a little bit of a code in here. Okay, I've got Italy, I, G for Germany, S for Spain, R for Russia and the Soviet Union, and outside Europe, even though this is largely a European oriented video, we've got the rise of a militarist regime in Japan. If we start to move beyond those 5 nations, we'd start throwing in some aspects of the nationalist regime in China and so on, and even criticism of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the 1930s in the United States, who was criticized as moving away from American democratic ideals, even though I think that's a bit unfair. Economically, it's a time period dominated by the economic Great Depression, a time of high unemployment, a time of limited investment, and perhaps that economic recession can be associated with the rise of a number of these political dictatorships, the locks of democracy in a number of places around the world. As we deal with these big themes and these big concepts of modern history, which are incredibly exciting and fascinating period, and I love these big themes, we need to bear in mind that at almost every juncture, history is also the story of individuals, story of groups of people. Therefore, we need to pay attention not just to the big story, but also to the smaller stories. There's big stories of world wars, dictatorships, systems of government, nations, the Great Depression. But we also need to be drilling down into how that impacts upon the lives of people. So often, this unit is studied as a history of Germany as this nation state. And to some extent, that's what we'll be doing. But I want you to bear in mind that there are sub-stories and parts of these stories that we need to look at as well. There's a key individual, Hitler. There's a key group, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, my German accent is terrible, but that's it in German, NSDAP. It's their story, an individual story, a group story, a nation story. It's also a story of attitudes and beliefs, motives, values. It's a story of racism, and in particular anti-Semitism, and how that plays out in thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of individual lives, each with their connections, each with their nuances, and we'll see some of the faces of that anti-Semitic story. And the Nazi Party at its core was anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. It's the story of the Holocaust, this unit. And when we start talking about the story of the Holocaust, and we start talking about the anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party and Hitler, the story changes from one that is a German story into a story that is inherently Jewish. And so we need to tell a Jewish history story, not just a German story, or an Australian story for that matter. And the Holocaust largely takes place not in Germany at all, but in Eastern Europe. And so it's an Eastern European story, a Polish story, if you like. It's a story also of war. It's a story of destruction of life, destruction of property, and an attempt to destroy a culture, a tradition. But it's also the story of resistance and liberation. And these are stories and themes that play out in a world history stage as well as an individual stage. It's a story of recovery from great annihilation, from tragedy, from destruction on epic scales. All of these themes that I'm talking about interrelate. The chronology, the politics, the economy, the nation state, the individual, the groups, the people, the themes of beliefs and attitudes, they all interrelate and they merge together. So we have to search for sense in that winding and look at Australia's place in the story, because we are an Australian school with Australian students. What's our place in that story? In that journey, we need to handle the stories with care, as I've said in this little pop-up, but also I guess I'm getting at that they're precious. These are not just theoretical concepts. There are lives lost. There are relatives of people in the room who have experienced these. I've taught students whose grandparents were connected to the Holocaust, who were both on the Nazi side and Jewish. And I guess when we're dealing with these stories of destruction and resistance and racism and hatred and all of this, there's a little bit of how do we respond that needs to come into our teaching of this and our study of this. What do we do with this knowledge? How do we unpack it? What do you as 15, 16-year-olds do with the knowledge you've gained here? What are the implications of our knowledge? So, let's push forward with one last idea as an introduction. We need to organise our thinking if all of these themes intertwine. We need to be able to spot the links, see the links, and know how we're going to use them. And to do that, as we move through our resources, I've been drawing upon a pool of resources I've been developing for some time and connecting these up for you. And I've created, as you'll see in your OneNote, a little bit of a code system. Every one of these themes that I've artificially separated into 3 different emphases in the slide you're seeing in front of you, every one of them blends together. It's perhaps impossible to separate Nazism from anti-Semitism. It's hard to separate Nazism and the Holocaust and Jewish communities. It's hard to separate individual lives from what happens in a nation when a democracy fails. But nevertheless, I've tried to make those separations just so you can impose an order on some meta themes. So, having a look at this diagram very quickly, we have 3 emphases in this unit. We've got the story of the German nation state, the rise of Nazism out of a failing Weimar Republic that was democratic. We've got the story of Jewish communities in Europe who become targeted by this National Socialist Nazi party that essentially goes to war against them. And that's a reading that modern historians are giving it. The Nazi state went to war on the Jews of Europe. It wasn't just World War II, there was a war on the Jewish people. We've got color coding and icons there that you'll see, and I've got one in this particular video so you can see how I'm trying to link ideas together. Color coding as you're looking at the resources that indicate what the theme, what the direction of the story is. The third emphasis is the story of Australia's involvement in the European aspects of World War II. Our part as a nation in the defeat of Nazism, in the ending of the Holocaust. The story of the refugees, the displaced people who leave Europe, who come and make a home in Australia. Many of them were Jewish, many leaving that destruction behind. The story of Australians who go and fight, often connected to the British military, in its struggle to end the German regime in World War II between 1939 and 1945. So that's hopefully enough to get you starting to think about how this unit is constructed and where we're heading with it.